So I graduated from nursing school back in 1966, and I started working at the hospital the hospital I graduated from. And the following year, our hospital opened an intensive care unit. And it was only the second intensive care unit in the state of Connecticut at that point. Um, and the year before, I had been working on a med-surg floor, medical surgical floor, and I had experienced a couple of different cardiac arrests. I'm just going to start my timer here so that I can kind of keep track of what time, where I'm at here. So I had experienced a couple of cardiac arrests, and I didn't feel like I knew what I was doing. So when the hospital said that they were going to open this intensive care unit, I decided I would join that pioneering staff and in that intensive care unit, because I thought that maybe they would teach us how to deal with cardiac arrest, which they did. So this picture that you see is the only picture that I have of me at work. And I'm like 26, 27 years old here. And I am, this picture, I am a head nurse in a coronary care unit in Pasadena, California at that point. So I started in critical care in 1967, and I retired in 2012. And those 47 years from 1967 to 2012, I was in critical care. And I moved around the United States, different cities, different towns, but I always worked in critical care. And at the beginning and the end of my career, I was at the bedside, but the kind of 30 years in the middle of my career, I was either in an administrative kind of position or an education kind of position. Administration could be like a head nurse of an ICU or a coronary care unit, and either a head nurse or a director of critical care, where I would be in charge of several critical care units in a hospital. Or I was in an education kind of position, again within critical care, like a critical care educator. Sorry about that. An educator within critical care, or critical care specialist, clinical specialist. So in those 30 years in between in my career, I was either an administrator or an education kind of position. The last years of my career, I went back to the bedside, and I was living and working in the town that I currently live in, Ashland, Oregon, which is a small, relatively small town in southwestern Oregon in the United States. And I was working in this little 4-bed ICU. I had never worked in such a small hospital or such a small ICU, and I was really loving it. But before I go there, I see the word education here. I just want to say a word about that. During the whole time that I was in nursing, I went back to school and got a bachelor's in nursing, a master's in nursing, and a master's in public administration. And my focus for a lot of my career was really kind of left brain stuff. I wanted to know how the body worked down to the cellular level, so that I could be the best critical care nurse that I could possibly be. So those last few years that I worked in critical care, as I said, I was in Ashland, Oregon here, and worked at Ashland Hospital. And we had groups of people that would show up in the ICU that were critically ill, and there were kind of two groups. There was one group that was really critically ill, and if we were able to treat them the way they needed to be treated, they would survive. But there was another group that, even though we could do whatever we could do, it was very unlikely that they would survive. And I started becoming concerned about that group. What were we doing? So the question that came to mind were we hindering their ability to have a peaceful death because we were only focused on trying to save their life at all costs? And saving their life for both of these groups of patients meant usually putting them in a medically induced coma, putting an endotracheal tube down their throat into their lungs, putting them on a ventilator, tying their hands down so that they wouldn't accidentally pull the tube out, and treating them. And the patients who didn't survive would die in that condition. And that was bothering me. And I didn't quite know, as I said, I didn't know how it was bothering me. So around that same time, I heard that there was a program that was going to be brought to our region called the Sacred Art of Living program. And it was the guy who had created it was a guy named Richard Groves, who has a center in a town about 100 miles from here. And that 2-year program was focused on working with people at the end of life to help them deal with issues that might be causing them to be struggling with dying and resisting dying. And Richard Groves had been studying death and dying for decades and been working in that field. And he identified that there were 4 types of issues that tended to keep people resistant to dying. And those were the issues around relationships, forgiveness, hope, and meaning. And he called them spiritual pains. So if somebody had one or more of those spiritual pains at the end of life, they tended to be resistant, not wanting to die, scared to die, and struggling not to die, even when their body was giving out. So that 2-year program, we learned to identify, diagnose, treat, and help people move through these spiritual pains. And I thought that maybe that would answer that question that I had originally had in my mind. And I'm not sure it totally answered that question. I probably still had some questions about that. But at the end of that program, which was a wonderful experience, and at the time I was still working in the ICU at Ashland Hospital. But when we finished that program, Richard was going to be presenting another 2-year program called an Anam Aira apprenticeship. And the words Anam Aira means soul friend or soul companion. It's Celtic words. And back in the Celtic times in Europe, between like the 6th century and the 12th century, in the Celtic villages and cities, there were people that would function as Anam Airas. And their role was to help people deal with any issues that they had at the end of life, to help them have a peaceful death. So I signed up for that program. And the first day of that program, the first hour of that first day, Richard was talking about the tradition of Anam Aira. And I had heard him speak about that in the previous program I had taken. And I remember sitting there thinking, well, it, I, it was interesting. I loved hearing about the tradition of Anam Cara and where that all came from, but I thought I wasn't going to learn anything new. But I was very wrong. uh, he said a few words, a few sentences that just knocked my socks off. He said, you know, there were some Anam Caras in the Celtic land that had a special ability. They could not only walk with someone to dying, you know, getting them ready to die, but these special Anam Caras could walk with someone through dying. They could escort them to the other side of the veil at the end of death, at the end of their life. And they were called Anam Aira. And the words Anam Aira means carer of the soul. And when he said that, I felt like I'd been hit with a bolt of lightning. I sat up in my chair and I said to myself, I need to know how to do that. And at that point, I didn't know why I thought that, and I didn't know how I was going to learn to do that. But I went through that program, and again, I was still in my last years of working as an intensive care nurse at Ashland Hospital. And then I retired in the end of 2012. And actually that year before I retired, I started doing the Anam Cara work. I was working with clients that from the local area here that heard about what I was doing, and they wanted me to help them get ready for dying. So I was starting to do that work already before I retired. And I understood and was doing the practice of Anam Cara. But I still had this thought about the Anam Aira concept. How was I going to learn how to do that? And what I remembered is that back in 1985, I was in a bookstore. And some of you probably have heard about, or maybe it's happened to you, where you are in a bookstore and a book, I'm just trying to get my, there. You're in a bookstore and a book falls off the shelf onto your foot. Well, that happened to me. And this book that fell on my foot was a book by Robert Monroe called Far Journeys. And so this was in 1985. I had, at that point in my life, I had been focused on understanding physiology and pathophysiology at the deepest level that I could go, at the deepest level that was known at that point. That's why I went back and kept getting more education in nursing, and that's why I went back and got a master's in nursing, to get that deeper understanding. However, it seemed to me, so I knew that Bob Monroe had through his books, that he had created this institute back in Virginia called the Monroe Institute. He created that in the early 70s. And it came out of his own experience of, in the 50s and 60s, 1950s and 60s. He was a businessman in New York City, and he started having spontaneous, what he later called out-of-body experiences. He was the one that created that term, out-of-body experiences. And initially he thought he was dying, or that he was going crazy, or something terrible was happening to him. And he went to doctors and psychiatrists, and nobody could find anything wrong with him. So eventually he started kind of playing with it. Nobody could tell him that he was dying or that he had any diagnosis, so he just started playing with it. So before he'd go to bed at night, he would say, okay, I want to wake up in London or Paris or wherever. And at 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning, that's where his awareness, that's where he would be, his awareness would be there. And as and he did that for several years. He was kind of bebopping around the earth. And at one point, he met a non-physical guide that said to him, "Do you want to have some other experiences other than what you've been having?" So he said, yes, he did want to have that. And so this guide took him to the other side of the veil. So his first book, Journeys Out of the Body, was about that first part of his life where he was kind of bebopping around the earth, having this kind of local experiences. Far Journeys was the first book that he wrote that was about his experiences on the other side of the veil. And then he wrote a third book called The Ultimate Journey that came out in like 2000 or 1992, I think. He died in 1995 at the age of 80, but the Monroe Institute is still going strong. And I knew that they taught people how to go to the other side of the veil. So I thought, well, it seemed to me that there were two parts of the process to become an Anam Aira. One is I would need to know when exactly somebody was going to die. And secondly, if I'm going to take them across the veil to the other side of the veil, I needed to know how to get there. And I didn't know how to get there. So I decided when I retired, I decided to go back to the Monroe Institute, and over about a month and a half period of time, I took 3 different programs back there. One was called the Gateway Program, which is the initial one that you take if you want to learn to travel on the other side of the veil. Teaches you to go to different levels of awareness that Bob Monroe had identified and experienced. And then there were 2 others, the Lifeline program that gave us more experience going to the other side, and then Exploration 27. There's one of the areas of levels of awareness or consciousness on the other side. He called Focus 27. And there's lots of things that happen in Focus 27. It's an amazing level of awareness on that side. When we as souls decide we want to come into to have another lifetime, to have another experience in a lifetime, we meet with guides and helpers who've been with us for eons of time, and we meet with them in Focus 27. And they help us plan out that lifetime. And we're all of us are part of the soul families, and our members of our soul families also meet with us at that time to plan out our life. And they, different members of our soul family will say, okay, I'll be your husband, or I'll be your child, or I'll be the boss that you have run-ins with, or I'll be the person that you'll learn the most from, or so they choose their roles that they're going to play in their lifetime, the same way we choose our roles that we're going to play in everybody else's lifetime that we're in existence with. So that happens in Focus 27. And when we die, most souls go back to Focus 27 and go through a reintegration process to go back into realizing that that's who we are. We are souls. So that I spent a week exploring Focus 27. And then a couple of years ago, I took an online program. The other 3, I was at the Monroe Institute. But the 4th one, Starline 1, I took online a couple of years ago. And we explored way out in the universe. We were out into, our galaxy, our galaxy clusters. We were way out, and it was an amazing experience. But I'm not going to talk about this in this talk. So one of the things that Bob Monroe had done in his exploration on the other side is he identified the different levels of awareness or levels of consciousness that exist on the other side and what happens in each of those kind of levels of awareness. Um, so, um, so after I went to the Monroe Institute, took those 3 programs, I came back here. I had just retired, and a whole bunch of my friends wanted to know what I had learned and what my experience had been. So I started having small groups of people that I would tell what my experiences were, and people would start saying, well, can you contact my mother or my brother or my father or my mother or my sister or my son who had died and find out how they're doing? So I started doing that, and how I would do that was to get into a meditative state. Now, Bob Monroe back in the 1970s had created this sound technology that he used to help people get into these deep meditative states. And it was a sound technology that he called hemisynchronization. And you're listening to the sound with headset on, and you're hearing one sound in one ear and a different sound in another ear, and it gives you a different sound in the brain. And it helped you get into a deep meditative state pretty easily. So I had used those hemisync CDs the whole time I was at the Monroe Institute. So when I came back and people started asking me to go check in with this loved one or that loved one who had died, I would put on one of those hemisync CDs, get into a meditative state, say the person's name, and then I would have an experience of them on the other side. And I would ask, if the loved one here had any questions for the person who died, I would ask those questions, and I would write down the whole interaction as it was happening. And then afterwards, I would type it up and email it to the person who had asked me to do that. So I did that for a year or so, and then a friend of mine who lived here in Ashland, her name was Kathy, and she had a twin sister who was living in Southern California at the time, and her sister's name was Karen, and she was dying and was struggling. She was in her home in Southern California and was struggling. She had caregivers around the clock, and they were having a hard time keeping her in bed. So Kathy had asked me if there was anything I could do to help her sister from a distance. And I said, well, I thought I could, but at that point, I had only connected in at the soul level with people who had died. I had not connected in at the soul level with somebody who was still alive. So I didn't know if I could do that, but I decided I would do the same process. I would just sit down, put on the hemisync CD, get into a meditative state, and say her name. And when I did that, I was with her immediately in her room in her house in Southern California. And I could see her in bed, and she was kind of moving back and forth around. And I could also see that her soul was kind of partway out of her body. So I introduced myself and said, well, for this part, I'd like to read. There's a kind of a short part of this that I'd like to read because how I've written it is better than my memory of how I experienced it. So if you don't mind, I'm going to read this part. Well, before I read that part. So when I first connected in with her, I told her who I was and that her sister had asked me if I could help her. And she said, no, you can't help me. Go away. Get out of here. She was a grumpy person by nature. Um, so I said, I decided that I would just kind of hang out to see if there was anything, if she would change her mind. So I just kind of hung out for a few minutes, and she did change her mind. She said, okay, uh, come back tomorrow. And I said, okay, I'll come back tomorrow. So this is where I'm going to pick up reading to you what I got. So I go to Focus 27 and call Karen's name. She responds immediately and with irritation. What is taking you so long to get here? It's very different from the experience I had the day before, where she just wanted me to get out of there. And then she says, okay, yes, I will trust you. Then I say, good. How can I help you? Karen, sounding worried. I am so frightened about dying. I don't know how to do it. I've been such an angry bitch my whole life. I'm afraid that I'm going to hell, even though I want to believe there is no hell. And as I said, I don't know if I said that or not, but she and her sister had grown up Baptist people. And her sister had stayed in a Baptist church her whole life, but Karen had not stayed in a church and had lived a very secular life. So she was afraid that she was going to go to hell. And I explained to her, there is no hell. It's only a trap that your mind can put you in. It feels like hell, but it's just a loop of thinking that keeps you stuck. Karen responds with intensity. How do I get out of this thinking? It's been this way my whole life. My mind is in control, and I can't help it. And I say, you can stop believing what your mind is telling you. You are not an angry bitch. You are a sacred, precious being. Karen, sounding a little irritated. How do you know? You don't even know me. And I say, I know that we are all precious beings. You are no different from anyone else on earth. You are a precious soul who has been living in a body. That soul will not live much longer. But as a soul, you will continue to live. You will go back to the joy and love that you were before coming into a body, the loving being that you are. Karen, very curious, how do I believe that? And I explained, you don't have to believe it, just allow it. Allow yourself to know the truth of it. And Karen, kind of nervous, says, how do I do that? And I say, listen to my voice, just listen. Focus on what I'm going to say. Listen without any judgment. Just for this time, imagine that your mind is still. Focus only on the words I'm going to say to you. Are you ready? Karen, unsure. Yes, I guess so. And at that point, I was as unsure as Karen, because I had no idea what I was going to say to her. But what's also true is that I know that I get guidance on the other side. So this is what I said to her, which did not come from me. It came from the guidance that I was getting. Karen, you are a precious holy being, full of love and understanding and compassion for that body you have. That body is not you. You are beyond, above, and wholly greater than your body. You are love. You are holy. You are an integral part of God. You are now, you have always been, and you will always be. Karen is silent, listening, barely breathing, taking this in, allowing it to sink into her awareness, into her soul, into her whole being. She starts to cry, a cry of release of judgment, anger, distrust, isolation, loneliness, and fear. Release of all of her negative feelings towards herself and others for a lifetime. Stillness now, profound, precious stillness, peace, joy, being held on wings of love. The immeasurable depth of stillness, peace, and joy last for some time. I have no idea how long, because it feels like forever. The encounter is so profound that I am barely breathing. I'm just sort of like breathing it kind of at the top. I felt like if I took a normal breath, it would somehow disturb the peace. Um, the stillness there and the stillness here are the same. There is no boundary between here and there. The profound stillness that surrounds Karen also surrounds me in my little cottage. Stillness beyond expression. Karen's family, her parents, and loved ones that she has known in this lifetime and other lifetimes, they are all surrounding her. They are holding her, loving her, hugging her. She is taking it in, allowing love to fill her, joy, peacefulness, the golden light of love. After some time, this experience fades, and I and my cottage are back. But I feel changed. I know that I am changed, but how, I don't know for sure. Everything that seems to make up my cottage also seems to be changed. The boards, the nails, the foundation, even my little dog Sophie sleeping at my feet. Everything is different, brighter, cleaner, open. From that moment, I truly knew who we are, who we all are. I knew, and I still know, I am, and everyone else is. Soul, spirit, mind stream, whatever the descriptor, we are beyond description. I was in a state of ecstasy for several hours after that. And after the ecstasy sort of eased off a bit, I called Kathy to let her know I had connected in with her sister and that I would be writing up this experience and I would take it over to her the next day. And at that time, she said that she'd gotten a call from the caregivers saying that, from her sister's caregivers saying that her sister had died around 3:30 that afternoon. And I had had this experience with her from around 1 o'clock to about 1:40. So I thought, well, maybe I had helped her in some way. I wasn't sure, but I thought I had helped her. So the next day, I took the write-up that I had written over to Kathy, and she said, you know, she didn't die at 3:30. That's when the hospice nurse came to pronounce her. And the pronouncement happens when somebody with the skills and expertise to assess that somebody has died come and do that, and they put down the date and the time that's happened, and that's the date and time that goes on your death certificate as the time you died, which was 3:30. However, the caregivers had later told Kathy that at around 1 o'clock she had calmed down. And that was the time that I started interacting with her. And that around 1:20, her heart had stopped and she stopped breathing. That's when she actually died, was 1:20. So I was with her from 1 o'clock to 1:40 when I was having all of these amazing experiences with her on the other side. So it was then that I realized that I had become an Anam Aira. I had escorted her across the veil at her moment of death. So I've been doing this work now for 10 years. I go across the veil for all kinds of reasons. I still go across for loved ones who are here, who want to find out how their loved ones on the other side are doing. I have escorted 7 people across the veil, like I did with Karen, in that similar way. However, one of the lessons or the ways that I learned about over on the other side was one of the things that I could do when I was working with people at the end of life is I could, with their permission, I could take their souls over to visit the other side. And I've done that with 50 or it's going on 60 or plus people now that I've done that for, where I take them over. And when I take them over, I take them to this area in Focus 27, and there's always loved ones of that person there waiting for them. It's a reunion that happens, and they meet with loved ones who have passed on, and have this wonderful experience. And then when they're ready, I bring their soul back to their body. And then they die, some hours or days later. But I don't have to then escort them at the moment of death, because for two reasons. They're now fine with dying. They've had this experience and they know what's on the other side. They know who's there to greet them. And they know they know about this loving experience that's on the other side. So they're not scared to go anymore. And the other thing that frequently happens, I think in my experience of doing this, I can't think of any time when it hasn't happened, where when I bring the soul back to the body, loved ones from the other side come back with them, and they stay. The souls of those loved ones stay with them until they're ready to transition. So then those loved ones' souls take them back over to the other side for their final transition. So I don't have to do that. And I go over for my own edification, for my own experiences. So at this point, I've had 10 plus years of experience now over on the other side, having all kinds of wonderful experiences. But what I'd like to do is at this point open it up for any questions. I mean, I've got a whole lot of case studies that I could talk about, but I'd rather open it up for questions at this point.